Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what it's been like to be a cannabis researcher, riding the storms of political and emotional debates and a sometimes divided scientific community for many years, before I then go on to tell you about my big idea in this era of heightened attention, not so much to recreational cannabis use, but to medical marijuana. So people have been using cannabis medicinally for thousands of years. Queen Victoria used it for period pain. But let's skip to some more recent sensationalism. This is how cannabis was portrayed in the era of prohibition in the 1930s. Now let's skip to the 1960s. And here you see prototypical images of cannabis users in the flower power, free love, hippie generation. But nevertheless, the community was concerned because we know what drugs did to these nice, clean-cut young men. And since then, we've had prominent figures come out and variously claim not to have inhaled, those who didn't quite know which way to swing in terms of their own admissions, and those who said, sure, I used in college, didn't everyone? What's the big deal? But soon, perhaps the prototypical images of cannabis users may change to this. And who are we to adopt the big brother draconian approach of denying what some would say are basic human rights and freedom of choice to alleviate suffering? Now, as a scientist, I am neither on the legalization campaign, nor am I anti-marijuana. Instead, I not so much sit on the fence, but I seek to inform science-based decision-making and evidence-based practice. So I have been conducting research into cannabis for more than 25 years, trying to understand the effects on the brain, and in particular, answering the question of, are there any long-term effects? So together with my team and collaborators, we've now published a significant body of research that does show changes to the structure and function of the brain in long-term heavy cannabis users. And I emphasize long-term heavy because the majority of people in our studies had been using cannabis on a near daily basis, multiple times per day for 20-odd years. Now, that is not how patients would use cannabis medicinally. We've published in some of the world's most eminent journals, and it's terrific to see that our key messages have been getting out there into the community. However, they've tended to be sensationalized with headlines that scream marijuana causes brain damage. And this makes me a scientist caught up in the maelstrom, and rather than being excited about our novel findings being published, quickly this turns to dismay with the number of hate mails that I receive. So not surprisingly, I get hate mail from the pro-legalization lobby who say, how dare I claim these kinds of effects for their drug of choice? It's a natural herb and it's harmless. But I also get hate mail from the medical marijuana lobby who say that my research is thwarting their cause and their access. Most extraordinarily, I also get hate mail from the anti-marijuana lobby who say that it's terribly irresponsible of me to state that perhaps infrequent use may not lead to significant harms. After all, it is the devil's drug. But aside from the hate mail, the most frequent queries that I get from the community are from distressed parents whose young sons or daughters developed schizophrenia after smoking cannabis, or from a range of people with medical conditions who claim that cannabis cured their illness. So as a scientist, I respond to this by pursuing further research to try to understand these disparate effects from one and the same drug. So we've tried to understand the association between cannabis and schizophrenia. It's complex, and we have pursued research to understand the effects of a range of different compounds within cannabis plant matter. So THC is the primary intoxicating agent. That is what gets you high, but it's also responsible for most of the adverse effects. Cannabidiol, or CBD, on the other hand, has anxiety-reducing properties, neuroprotective and even antipsychotic properties. Our studies with CBD showed that it reversed or protected from brain harms, reduced psychiatric symptoms, and improved cognitive function. But the haters have not picked up on this research, or they've chosen to ignore it, whereas we think it's really exciting and we look forward to translating this with CBD as a therapeutic agent, possibly for a range of different conditions. Many of the cannabinoids in cannabis plant matter do possess potential therapeutic properties. The evidence is mounting, but it is far from definitive. The best evidence that we have is for analgesia, pain, epilepsy, stimulating appetite, suppressing nausea, and reducing spasticity. In response to this, the New South Wales and Victorian governments have established ongoing clinical trials, some of which I'm involved in, very worthy and absolutely necessary to establish the efficacy of these compounds. But before these trials were even halfway through, the Australian government announced the legalisation of medicinal cannabis. And this was done as a politically driven response to enormous pressure from the community, but implemented without any underlying infrastructure in place to manage this and catching the medical community unprepared. So exactly how this industry should be regulated, how and where should medicinal cannabis be grown, what kind of formulations do we need as a medicine, what should doctors be advising their patients, and how do we enable safe product to be accessed by patients? None of this was developed in advance of the legislation and continues to be debated today. What we do know, though, is that Australia will not follow the lead of the United States with inappropriate advertising, billboards, and marketing. In the United States, the majority of people accessing medicinal cannabis are in fact not patients, but recreational users. And recreational cannabis use has now been legalised across many states. All of this has led to the proliferation of a wide range of colourful cannabis products, edibles, drinkables, many on display at your local corner shop near schools. And it's not too far-fetched to consider that perhaps this will be the next product available at your local corner store. One of the reasons for this is that the medical marijuana lobby have been propped up by the likes of this. Entrepreneurs who don't care about patients, don't care about health effects, and don't care whether kids might be exposed to harms. They are only in it to make a buck. And in fact, the cannabis industry is now the most fastest growing industry in the United States. In Australia, there are about 50 new startups applying for licenses to grow cannabis every week. And the legislation is chopping and changing according to whether it should be grown outdoors in Australia's ideal climate, which is then subject to contaminants like bird poop, seriously, fungi, toxins, heavy metals in soils. Or should it be grown indoors and hydroponically? But good manufacturing practice has not been enforced, and companies are not required to undertake serious research and development for their products. So one has to ask the question of what other medicine has ever been approved in such a poorly regulated way, ill-formulated, untried and tested in target populations with no dosage information or guidelines available to medical practitioners. Now, the legislation has sought to overcome the problem of patients having to source the product illegally, but that is still occurring with some quite significant harms in the community and some very shonky backyard practices. Why? Because safe product is not yet available in Australia, and the hoops that patients and doctors have to jump through to import good product are currently prohibitive. We have an opportunity to get it right at this critical time in Australia. We could lead the world in the implementation of safe medicinal cannabis products with an underlying base of science and research. It takes time, but we need to get it right. We need proper clinical trials that will establish the efficacy of these compounds, will guide us in terms of appropriate formulations of medicines. We need education for doctors, and we need safe access for patients. So what is my big idea? To build a scientific evidence base to bring quality and safety to the implementation of medicinal cannabis use in the community. It's not such a big idea. It's not earth-shattering. It's just sensible. Thank you.